this is where it gets to the point where you just can't accept it, and you have to say, look, that's too far. For anyone who can't remember or didn't see it, it was approximately something like men can get periods too, or something like that. It was more than that. It was, there's more than one way to be a man.
Yep.
Men can have periods. Yep. Men can get pregnant and give birth.
Yes.
And it's at that point where they're demanding that we believe something that is counter to reality. You know, it's just not the case. And
it's equivalent of tweeting out 2 + 2 = 5, and if you don't agree, you're a bigot.
Yeah.
That's it.
And the thing is, there doesn't seem to be any kind of organized resistance to forcing people to believe something that they can see is not true with the evidence of their own eyes. And that's my real problem with all of this. I hate to use the term because it's so overused, but that is Orwellian. You know, that's what the party did in 1984.
And I'm very worried about the creation of this elitist new language with words like they, non-binary, cisgender, heteronormative, the kind of words that ordinary people do not use, but they are used by a new elite to signal that they are good people, to signal that they are part of the in club, and anyone who refuses to use them or who fails to use them is shut out and demonized and written off as transphobic. So I'm worried about the Orwellian rearrangement of language to satisfy very small numbers of people.
What are all these quotes talking about? I've tended to notice people claim words like heteronormativity are these Orwellian words to co-opt human speech for the trans agenda. I find that these new words are just new words to describe new concepts. Now, longtime friend of the channel, Abigail Schreier, even has a quote about this in her book, Irreversible Damage. In this way, woman's biological uniqueness is denied outright. All references to our specialness is stripped with the acid of intersectional language. Pregnant women are increasingly referred to as pregnant people, and the word vagina replaced with the hideous phrase front hole. The more inclusive language strives to whitewash the feminine nature of anatomy that trans-identified biological women would prefer to forget. The mainstream media has cottoned onto this newspeak with the wet-lipped, wide-eyed excitement of toddlers. In an October 19, 2019 tweet, NPR announced people who menstruate spend an estimated $150 million a year on just sales tax for tampons and pads in the service of trans-inclusive language. Women become people who menstruate. Okay, so what is newspeak? The concept of newspeak is a conlang in the book 1984.
Conlangs are languages that have been made up by a person rather than being a naturally occurring language that's evolved over time.
This language is in contrast to Old Speak, which is basically standard English, and with that, the language is partly defined by the aspect of the fact that it is shrinking the dictionary so as to make certain thoughts impossible.
The purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the worldview and mental habits proper to the devotees of Ingsoc, but to make all other modes of thought impossible.
The chief idea here being that other thoughts are impossible through the constriction of that language. Now, my kind viewers, and also the not-so-kind ones, I see you too. A lot of transphobes have the thought that sex and gender are the same thing, and if they think that, and they have the social power to teach their worldview as fact, how can trans people even exist in that framework, unable to state the opinion that they are not the right gender? Is that idea Orwellian? Wow, is that the whole video? Shit. Wait, no, let's talk about sex and gender. I know none of the hyper-rational, anti-postmodern, neo-Marxist skeptics are just gonna let that last bit about gender and sex not being the same thing skip by, and I thought I would explain my views on the subject. So firstly, let's talk about gender discordance and gender concordance. These concepts are talking about the idea of the body not fitting the sex you were born into. A lot of trans people also call this gender dysphoria, and I guess you could say also gender euphoria. And now, here's something to think about. Can cis people have gender dysphoria? Well, there's the famous case of David Reimer and John Money's experiments on him as a young boy. Oh, who is John Money? Well, John Money is a sexologist who pioneered the concept of non-consensual genital surgeries, on intersex infants. And Money would go on to do a similar thing with David Reimer. David Reimer had a botched circumcision, which left him without a penis at 8 months old. Also, I should note that I hate the idea of circumcision, but that's not on topic. Money advising the Reimer family was like, I know how to fix this. David Reimer would go on to have lots of issues with his early life as a girl. And eventually, after learning about what had happened to him, he would later transition back into being a man. It should be noted that Dr. Money also had David and his twin enact sex acts, with David being the bottom role to help socialize David into being a girl. What the fuck? What the fuck is up with these old school, like, sexologists being really fucking pedophilic? Dr. Money also brought in a trans woman to eventually try to convince David to have a vaginoplasty, because at this point, David just had a penectomy. And after this incident, David said that if he had see Dr. Money again, he would kill himself. David did in fact kill himself in 2002. We can't know with full certainty that it was to do with this treatment that he got as a child, but his final interview about it kind of suggesting as such. Another interesting case of gender dysphoria in cis people was of that doctor I showed off in that video about Schreier, Dr. Will Powers.
Flame on.
He had a funny experience about this where he accidentally overdosed on estrogen face cream of his own concoction for anti-aging purposes and told his subreddit about it.
And this was a terrible mistake. The following night, I had a dream that I was developing gynecomastia. It was bizarre to have such a dream, as I literally have never had anything of the sort in my head my whole life. People always think I'm secretly trans or have some transgender family member. Nope. I honestly love what I do because it's a puzzle that hasn't been solved by everyone else yet. The biochemistry is fascinating. Regardless, in regards to the gynecomastia dream, I didn't think much of it. I showered in the morning, saw myself in the mirror, all was well, just a dream. Flamed on to see patients, had a good day, went to bed. I woke up the following morning, and all was not okay. I leaned over, and my chest hurt. I was very confused until I touched my chest and realized my nipple was hard as a rock and insanely painful. Realizing I had probably screwed up by using a full gram, I ran to the bathroom to look at the bottle and pretty much gasped in horror. I had not only used 5 times the normal amount, I used 100 times the normal dose effectively. Twice. In 2 days, I had given myself more estrogen than I would normally give myself in like 6 months. I normally use a fifth of a 10 milligram dose once or twice a week, so 4 milligrams a week at most or less than 1 milligram a day. I gave myself 200 milligrams in 2 days. Dysphoria crashed over me like a literal wave as I was scrambling to think how I could undo my screw-up. I imagined the horror scenario like I had started some unstoppable progress, and this would just continue unabated even if I stopped the estrogen. I rapidly dreamed up whatever pharmacology I could think of to reverse the process as quickly as possible, and used it. Thankfully, 2 days later, all went back to normal. However, during those 2 days when my estrogen was like stupidly high, I could not stop thinking about how awful it was, and how much I didn't want those changes to happen to my body. It was really, honestly, pretty terrible, and I have a newfound empathy for gender dysphoria as a problem. I had sympathy before, but now I have empathy, as I think I got a small taste of what that must be like to deal with. It literally dominated my thoughts for 2 days, and I had nightmares about it. Embarrassing as this story is to tell, I think it important to share.
You can read about the story more on his subreddit. A link to this will be in my sources in the doobly-doo. Now, gender dysphoria doesn't make you trans, but gender dysphoria seems to be the result of raising a child in the wrong gender. I have it, at least in remission, and I know tons of trans people that also have dysphoria, and the goal of HRT is to alleviate this. I brought up this meta-analysis in my Schreier video, but basically HRT alleviates the symptoms of dysphoria and helps trans people with overall well-being. Now, to put this into summation, cis people have gender concordance and can get gender dysphoria if we fuck with their gender. And when we treat gender dysphoria in trans people, it produces the same gender concordance that cis people have. Seemingly, this should kind of go to point to a general idea that gender and sex seem to be separate constructs. If this doesn't convince you about what trans people go through, I don't know what to tell you. But how about retrying the David Reimer experiment on yourself to prove that HRT doesn't help trans people? And from what I can tell, HRT helps this population out, so since this would basically be an easy thing for cis people to do, since Trans people must be faking it to be doing HRT and enjoying the results. Go do HRT, transphobes, and prove us wrong. Whoa, Samantha. Breadtube doesn't like death metal. We can't liven this up with the song Forced Gender Reassignment? No. Just no. Anyway, let's talk more about Orwell's idea of Newspeak in some more depth. Now, I talked about the concept of constricting a language in the context of 1984, and I am not a philosopher or a linguist, so if this has a different name for this concept, totally feel free to comment it down below. But the concept is of constrictive language versus expansive language. A constrictive language is one where you can't express as many ideas in that language, or they are obscured by the fact that you need more words to explain a concept. And an expansive language is one where you have more ability to express the thoughts and feelings you have. In essence, more vocab. This is also just a comparative term in reality. This language is more expansive in X topic than that language. Let's take in some examples. Take these 4 sentences. I love my children, I love God, I love my wife, I love my best friend. If you notice, these 4 sentences, they all use love, but they don't mean the same concept in each one. We will require more words in English to explain each of these concepts, but in the language Greek, they just have a word for each of these concepts and more. If you're curious, the first phrase is storge or agape, the second phrase is agape, the third is agape or eros, and the fourth is philia. You could say Greek is more expansive in the concept of love in some of its forms. If you're curious of this, I will link a source in my description of the Wikipedia article to this. Here's another example in the language Arabic. The word zina is a word that both means fornication and adultery, and in the religion Islam, this actually gives way to legal arguments about the punishment for the crime of committing zina. We have hadiths that clarify this a little bit more, but this causes the issue that when we translate this, we could translate this as adultery, fornication, or if no context, illegal sexual intercourse, or I guess in Newspeak, sex crime. See page 306 of 1984. The point of 1984's concept on language is that if we don't have the words to express ourselves, we can't explain our issues to the world and cannot therefore even truly think.
It was impossible to translate any passage of Old Speak into Newspeak, unless it either referred to some technical process or some very simple everyday action, or was already orthodox in tendency. Pre-revolutionary literature could only be subjected to ideological translation, that is, alteration in sense as well as language. Take, for example, the well-known passage from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. It would be quite impossible to render this into Newspeak while keeping to the sense of the original.
Drank some specialty, home with Wavy, Daisy, and she told me you're doing alright.
So there's a concept in philosophy called phenomenology. Let's give the formal Stanford Encyclopedia philosophy definition. Phenomenology is commonly understood in either of 2 ways, as a disciplinary field in philosophy or as a movement in the history of philosophy. The discipline of phenomenology may be defined initially as the study of structures of experience or consciousness. Literally, phenomenology is the study of phenomena, appearances of things, or things as they appear in our experiences, or the ways we experience things, thus the meanings things have in our experience. Phenomenology studies conscious experience as experience from the subjective or first-person point of view. This field of philosophy is then to be distinguished from and related to the other main fields of philosophy: ontology, the study of being or what is; epistemology, the study of knowledge; logic, the study of valid reasoning; ethics, the study of right and wrong action, etc. So, just for some basics, people have experiences and they name them. There is the term effemimania, which is the societal obsession with men and trans women's expression of femininity. You know what I'm talking about. Now you have a word for that. Amazing, am I right? A lot of people think that postmodern, neo-Marxist, leftist snowflakes created all of these new terms like non-binary, genderqueer, and obviously just any queer language in general in like the last 20 years. I don't think it matters how recent a term is because trans people have a long history already, and that should be enough credence to create new terms that we find true to our experiences. We have, of course, the story of Christine Jorgensen, who transitioned in the 1950s after learning about endocrinology and dealing with severe bouts of depression, with finally realizing that she could transition, and that transition alleviating her gender dysphoria. That isn't the only story about weird gender feels from the past eras. There is this story from Magnus Hirschfeld's book, Transvestites. You can also find this exact story in the book, Transgender History. I was born in 1862, and I did not want any trousers and put up such a fuss, and since my sister was 1 year older, I could wear her clothes until my mother died in 1868. My aunts then forced me to wear boys' clothing. I clearly remember that I always wanted to be a girl, and my relatives and acquaintances would tease me. I wanted to go to the teacher's seminary because later I thought when I finished I could go around as a governess or as a children's teacher. Even at the time, I had firm plans to become a woman. When I saw that they were not going to allow me to study to be a teacher, at the first opportunity I stole from a girl who was my size, I put on her things and took her certificate of domicile and burned my boys' things that night. Everything boyish I left behind and went to Switzerland where my relatives would not know where I was. I first went to work as a nanny and did my general housework. At the same time, I learned embroidery. I grew strong and not ugly so that boys would lie in wait for me. At the time, I felt fully a young woman, except when the fellows got fresh with me, and it would occur to me that, unfortunately, I was not one. At 16 and a half, a man tried to rape me. I protected myself, but he gave me a bad name for being hermaphrodite, so I had to move away and went to France. I had a friendship with a girl who, like me, was in opposition to her sex, namely manly. She went to St. Quentin to the embroidery factory. There, I followed her. There, I had the opportunity for the first time to come together with women who, with other women, lived like married people. In 1882, I left France and went to New York. Here, I soon found work as a maid on a farm because I thought I would be able to live there inconspicuously. But one day, the farmer's wife was away and he became fresh. I was afraid of the discovery and left that place and got a good job in Jersey City. I became acquainted with an embroiderer who found out I was no young woman. He threatened to call the police to tell them I was playing a masquerade. He forced me into sodomy and fellatio, and a few months passed during which I got more miserable each day. One morning I packed everything together, and when he was away, sold everything of worth. I went to Montana as a woman cook. There, however, betrayed again, I took myself to San Francisco in 1885, and I still live there today. I am now 47 years old. It is my deepest wish to wear a new princess dress, a new flowered hat, and lace petticoats. I decorate my bedroom in the manner of women, and a man seldom enters my room because I am no friend to men. Conversations with women satisfy me more, and I am envious of educated women because I look up to them. For that reason, I've always been an activist for equal rights. And again, this isn't even the earliest story of people expressing a non-typical gender expression. The story of Albert D.J. Cashier, the Union soldier who was assigned female at birth but donned a male name and male attire. This person was born in the 1840s. They lived as a man until basically the end of their life. Hell, I could even go on about the surgeon James Barry, who was born in the 1790s, and it wasn't until his wishes were not followed after his death that we learned that he is a trans man. Now, that is just 230 years of trans historical figures briefly summarized, but this is only to talk about Western transsexualism itself. There are other forms of transgender identity that I didn't even mention here. I could bring up all the third gender traditions of other cultures, whether that be the two-spirit traditions of indigenous cultures of North America, or the Katoe of Southeast Asia, and the Hijras of South Asia. And these are all traditions that have even older references than the basic concept of Western transsexualism. Wow, imagine trying to describe these cultures without any type of non-binary language. Now, that Schreier video got a lot of people asking me to define a woman, and I kind of don't like the concept of defining people outright. But if you must ask me, a woman is a person who identifies as one. Now, I know that is tautological to a degree, but definitions are by themselves always a little flawed.
So suppose you had an organism that wasn't equipped to learn the words of human language, and you really had to teach it those words by training. Well, you'd first have to define a word. What is the meaning of table, for instance? Nobody can do that.
You have to define the definition you're using to define the word.
But, you see, what we call definitions are not definitions. They're just hints. If you take the Oxford English Dictionary, the one you read with a magnifying glass, and they give you a long, detailed thing, which they call the definition of a word. In fact, it's very far from a definition of a word. It's a few hints that a person who already knows the concept can use to understand what's going on.
What I mean by flawed is any definition that you try to make about womanhood that tries to exclude trans women is going to exclude some cis women by pure definition. So you may say, a woman is a person who has XX chromosomes. Now, I should note that there are many people you will call a woman in life who have XY.
De La Chapelle's super cool. You're XX, but due to a freak thing that occurs at conception, the SRY gene from a Y chromosome gets copied over to you. And so despite being XX, you have a penis and testicles and look like me. But they're XX, and they're infertile.
Or any number of DSDs that can make you have a non-typical karyotype. But you also have me, who has XX chromosomes, who is defined in with that, which, nice. But also the fact that I use this on TERFs all the time, and the amount of times they just assume my chromosomes is kind of just funny. Also, not all people with XX male syndrome, also called De La Chapelle syndrome, are trans women. I even did this to someone in the comments of my Schreier video, but here's an example defining men as women and women as not women. Here's another example. If they have a uterus, then they are a woman. Well, women with hysterectomies, or should I say hysterectomies, aren't women anymore. And, really, are we gonna entertain that Buck Angel is a woman? Walking down the street with no context, we never think about it or even ask about the reproductive organs of people. We don't sense people's genitalia or their internal sexual anatomy. Also, if you're concerned with this definition because you want to marry someone based on their ability to reproduce, maybe just ask this prospective partner whether they want biological children one day. And maybe that's enough of a question that if you're on a date with a woman without a uterus or is infertile in any way, they might just tell you. Also, are we really boiling down a woman down to being a baby maker? I don't know. This just seems like a bad definition. A bunch of women, cis women, are just no longer women because of pedantic definitions, which obviously the next definition being if a person can get pregnant, then they are a woman. Imagine talking about old women who are no longer able to reproduce because of menopause. Are we really going to be like these old people with vaginas? Actually, my gender is grandma. Many cis women just don't have the ability to get pregnant, and hence that's why it's a bad definition. The prevailing trend is that definitions of women that try to write out trans women somehow define certain men and certain women as both women and not women, when self-identification seems to just answer this way fucking better. Let's go back to that Schreier quote for a second and explore it in a little bit more depth. In this way, women's biological uniqueness is denied outright. References to our specialness stripped with the acid of intersectional language. Pregnant women are increasingly referred to as pregnant people. How does this deny women their biological uniqueness? Is it today because some men and some non-binary people can also be pregnant? You can also still say pregnant women, like if I'm talking about Abigail Schreier getting pregnant, she is a pregnant woman. She actually was a pregnant woman because she has 2 kids. And you know what else she is? She's a pregnant person. It's it almost makes it sound like women are not people. Are women not people, Abigail? the word vagina replaced with the hideous phrase front hole, the more inclusive language strives to whitewash the feminine nature of anatomy that trans-identified biological women would prefer to forget. I mean, that's a value judgment, Schreier. Not all women think that the phrase front hole is hideous. Some trans people use vagina when talking about their sexual anatomy, and some don't. Gosh, right-wingers get so worked up over the littlest things by just trans people talking, basically. I can almost sympathize. I hate when dicks are called cocks. Am I going to do anything about it? No. Mainstream media has cottoned onto this newspeak with the wet-lipped, wide-eyed excitement of toddlers. In an October 19th, 2019 tweet, NPR announced people who menstruate spend an estimated $150 million a year just on the sales tax for tampons and pads. In the service of trans-inclusive language, women become people who menstruate. Well, again, women aren't the only people buying these, Schreier, but I guess she really has the need to call trans-masculine and AFAB MBs women, instead of just saying that some people who menstruate aren't women. And I don't know, the far right seems to get really worked up over the simplest shit. The simple thing is that this language doesn't even eliminate the other words. It's not even Orwellian in the sense that Orwell was eliminating language in his book, 1984. This is off script. Like, we have like terms like woman, man, and then over here we have like terms like non-binary, trans woman, trans man, cis woman. These terms, you can still use man and woman. Like a trans woman is just an identifier, like an adjective, just the same as like a black woman, a white woman, an Asian woman. These are all just adjectives. A transgender woman is just another type of woman, but Abigail Schreier doesn't think so. And, like, I don't know. That's kind of transphobic. Let's move on. I feel I've just beat this point into the ground by now. I don't know. These transphobes just seem to call any trans-inclusive form of language newspeak. And I guess, like, we shouldn't let our boy Orwell be co-opted by the far right. You know, the Orwell that went and fought against fascists in the Spanish Civil War. When Orwell is talking about newspeak, he is talking about the concept of not even being able to think of an idea because your brain will never be exposed to the idea. In truth, this is the reason transphobes don't want to teach about trans people to younger generations. They would rather let us suffer without knowing who we are, because the more you read about trans people and LGBTQ plus people in general, not all of us know who we are until we are exposed to the concept. I have thought about what I would be if I had been born 50 or 100 years ago, and I think this quote from Serrano's Whipping Girl sums up my experience. In our experience, what it means to be a woman or a man, the symbols, customs, expectations, restrictions, and privileges associated with those classes are very different today than they were 50 years ago. This holds true for both typical and exceptional gender inclinations. For example, in this time and place, I'm able to identify as a woman, a dyke, a transsexual, and a transgender person. To me, each of those identities represent a slightly different but somewhat overlapping aspect of my gender and sexuality. However, if I had been born a half-century earlier, before most of these labels were commonly used or even existed, it would be impossible for me to identify it the way I do now. Perhaps my female subconscious sex would have led me to try passing and living as a woman, as trans people often did before medical means of transitioning became widely available. Or perhaps I would have taken part in the homosexual underground of the time, which was an amalgamation of people who would probably be considered lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender today. Or maybe, unaware of the existence of gender-variant people, I might have remained closeted for the lack of any other alternative. I think that this is the reason transphobes freak out about this language, because the second trans people might come to learn that they are LGBTQ+, a few might realize it to themselves and will make the change which harms their conservative worldview. You know, the worldview which is like basically the world ought to be one man, one woman, a dog, and 2.5 kids, just like the Bible says. Many queer people don't realize there's gender or sexuality, and if you don't believe me, just maybe read the Stonewall Reader. This is the goal of these types, to not let people know about the alternatives to their lifestyle, in hopes that people stay closeted. And, you know, Folks, let's not let them have that society. Living in the closet fucking sucks, and I don't think any one of us wants to go back in.
Cracked incandescent street lamps near turnpikes. I got a nondescript place that I'm telling you, you should spend the night where the water's warm.
Hey everyone, thanks for watching the video. This took me a while to make because I need some time to think about this, and I really wanted to do a good job on making this video. I had to reread Orwell's 1984, and like the most useful sentences are actually in the section at the end of the book called The Principles of Newspeak. I was considering going further into the themes of 1984, but I figured if I'm just going to do that, I should just make a video dedicated to Orwell himself, since he wrote a lot about the world, and I think he's quite a fascinating figure in world history. I also finally got to explain one of the lines from the Schreier video, the Schreier wants two classes of people line, without saying really directly in this script, but I kind of wanted to make a note here that the conclusion in part 6 of this video are mainly concerning the ideas of othering trans people into a whole different category, and not mentioning this facet of humanity to children, is to make, from what I believe, as few eggs crack as possible. I also cut out a lot from the script, and I wanted to have a section about how queer nature is in my history section, but I don't know, I'll have to save that for another video. Here's a picture of a FTM lion to tide my thirsty trans followers over until I talk about how queer nature is. But I'm gonna need some time to think more about this. Anyway, this has been a lot of fun, and I'm very thankful to my patrons. I'm also very thankful to Jangles Science Lad, and Lewibaton. I'm very thankful to those two YouTubers. They did the two voiceovers, and I don't know, it's just very nice to have some other voices on my videos. I did a voiceover for Jangles. I highly recommend that video on Schreier. It's better than mine. If you like my content, the likes and comments go a long way, and subscribing is also amazing if you want to do that. But if you want me to do this at a faster rate, the best way to support me is on Patreon. Anyway, thanks everyone. Have a very good day or night or whatever time it is for you. Bye.
Humidity and make-believe, they sell powders made from strange trees. Your Adderall, it's the same thing. I walk through them all on pain pills. Laundromat district with the artists and the hipsters. There's a lovely girl that walks the street in a sequin miniskirt. So play nice and stay humble. Keep your business out the alley. Only drink dark beer from a bar called O'Shea's or O'Malley's. Guests arrive.